I mentioned a little bit earlier, we have specific congressional authorization to double dip in transit. And again, stems back to some of the initial discussions at the federal and state level in the development of the 5311 program. And we in rural transit have always had the ability to use revenues derived that we have earned from the provision of service under contract to a state or local human service organization, whether it's a public agency or a nonprofit human service agency. We could use those revenues as local match to FTA dollars, even if that social service or human service agency were using federal dollars that typically do not lose their identity to buy service from us, the transit provider. We are violating the no double dipping rule in the 7 commandments that we talked about this morning. And it was a purposeful, intentional act of Congress that gave us permission to do so. And so we have that authority. So let's talk about how that works. It's an unbelievable benefit. It has public policy implications that extend far beyond the math of doing grant application budgets. It promotes service coordination between public transit and human service agencies, which has been a goal in this country since the 60s. It was originally, as I noted this morning, uniquely associated with just the 5311 program until the year 2005, when Safety Lou was adopted. And we didn't see this coming, but Congress added these unique matching provisions to the JARC program, to the New Freedom program, to the 5310 program, to the Urban Formula program, 5307. Now, Congress giveth and Congress taketh away. They subsequently took away the JARC and New Freedom programs and technically rolled them over into the existing 5311 program, where they gave us a little more money, but not enough, and they rolled the JARC, or the New Freedom program, into 5310 and didn't give us any money. So those 2 programs, if you've never heard of them, don't worry about it, they don't exist anymore. And if you get any adverse reaction from grant professionals who tell you, no, you can't use federal funds to match other federal funds, you will want to highlight Chapter 49 of the United States Code, Section 5311, Subpart G, Subpart 3, Subpart C, is where you will find that language for 5311. You will find similar language in the United States Code associated with 5310 and 5307. I've talked about some of the history and Senator Leahy's contributions. So what are some of these sources? I mentioned a GAO report that earlier in this century, issued in 2002, I believe, identified 62 separate federal programs that would pay for passenger transportation, or the transportation, what OMB calls transit, or what GAO, calls transit disadvantaged individuals. FTA owned about 10 of those programs. So there were about 62 coming from 12 other departments that could be used as match. If you looked at those 52 programs and tried to figure out how much each program was spending, and go for the target-rich environments, if you were a transit agency, Medicaid would be at the top. It was then, it is now. And the schematic would be even worse today, because most of the other programs have gone down Medicaid is one of the few of the remaining 52 that's gone up. In fact, if you added up the top 10 in 2002, out of those non-FTA programs, the 52, 10 of the programs equaled 90% or better of all the money that GAO was able to identify. GAO, by its own admission, couldn't identify all the money because some federal programs have no idea how much they spend on client transportation. Believe it or not, that still is true to this day. The top ones today, in my mind, are veterans. Medicaid is number one by a long shot. Number two is not even close. Title IIIB used to be up there. I'm not even sure they're in the top 5 in FY18. Veterans has risen possibly in the number 2 spot right now. And as I mentioned this morning, there is no FTA list of what programs you could use with some degree of confidence without running into trouble under these unique matching provisions. FTA does not distribute a list.
Rich, there is a list for the qualifying human service agencies, though, right?
Well, there is a list of organizations that could possibly, if they receive funding from any of these sources, FTA would take that into account in rendering a decision whether or not they were a qualifying human service agency organization. And what FTA did in the appendix to the April 15th, 2008 charter regulation in the Federal Register, they attached the list that came from the 2002 GAO report.
And US has somewhere.
So that's where it comes from. So that's what I said a little bit earlier, why I believe that GAO list has a little credibility, because FTA used it once before in terms of qualifying eligible charters that otherwise wouldn't be permitted. There are some rules. This is not carte blanche in terms of the rules of these other matching funds. The first rule handcuffs the state. The state cannot prohibit you from putting forth contract revenue as local match. Some states tried to do that, and FTA had to step in and say, the law does not give you the authority to limit you at the project level from using contract revenues as match. Patrick Leahy was insistent that you could use contract revenues to meet all the local matching share. You at the operator level have a choice what to do with these contract revenues. You can use them as local match, or you can use them in what FTA calls the traditional or deductive method. The deductive method is a term that is used in the consideration of program income that we'll talk about in tomorrow. And it's an eligible use of program income. Rather than using it as local match, you deduct it from total operating cost. You reduce the federal and local share of the project. And that has benefits to all parties in the contract. Whereas using it as local match primarily benefits you, not the federal government. But you're allowed to choose which of these two methods, the deductive method or the match method, on your contract revenues. The deductive method, you basically treat contract revenues the exact same as you treat fare box revenue. And it's your choice. Now, because there are some concepts borrowed from the treatment of program income, it actually creates a little confusion if you've got a real grants professional on your hands. One of the things I want to be clear is if you use contract revenues as match, you can use them as match to the grant from which they were earned. So in other words, you get an operating assistance grant for FY18. If you earned program income from that grant, FTA does not let you use program income as local match in the year in which it was earned. You have to hold that and use it as local match in a future year. FTA is clear that if you use FY18 operating assistance, this is how you paid the drivers, this is how you maintain the vehicles, this is how you fueled the vehicles while you were transporting Medicaid clients, and they paid you in that fiscal year, you can use that Medicaid revenue as matched to the FY18 operating grant. Does everybody understand that? Advertising revenue, to give you the contrast, is a form of program income. There are different allowable federal treatments of program income, including the deductive method and the local match method. FTA once again gives you the choice. Most elect to use program income as local match. But with program income, FTA requires you or stipulates that you can't use it to match the year in which it was earned, the grant year in which it was earned. It's got to match another grant. FTA's logic on this, I actually wrote the FTA administrator once because I couldn't figure out this rationale. And they said, well, after we talked to the attorneys, we kind of agree on this position that we take in the circulars because we ask you to identify up front your sources and amounts of local match because we need to verify you've got sufficient local match before we can award a grant. With advertising revenue, your income will vary throughout the year depending on what your advertising contract is, and you may not know the revenue streams coming in under an advertising contract. Therefore, we make you accumulate it, bank it, hold it, and apply it in the subsequent year when you know exactly how much you got. That was the legal explanation for this policy. I bring this up that revenues can be counted in the year in which it was earned because contract revenues are treated differently than program income. And FTA goes to great lengths to let you know that you can take the revenue you earned in May and apply it as local match to the operating assistance you apply for or seek reimbursement of in June. You can use it the year in which it was earned. Again, because we've now expanded the use of 5310, which used to be a capital-only program, now that we've expanded the use of that funding source to other purposes, FTA also wants to be clear that FTA funds cannot be used as match to 5311, and vice versa. Because you technically could have a purchase of service arrangement that you plan to use 5310 funds to buy service from a 5311 provider. You can't use the 5310 revenue as local match. Can't do that. That's really the key point to understand. Here is an example of the mathematics of using either the deductive scenario where you count contract revenue as match versus the second scenario where you use it as local match. So here we've got a rural transit system that has collected $82,000 in fare box revenue. Looks like this is primarily a demand response organization because they've got a substantial contract revenue stream flowing here. looks like I took this example from Tennessee. And so, stop it, fat thumbs. So what we have is if we count it as fares, the net cost of service here is only $600K. Means the federal share is only $300, our local share is $300. That's pretty straightforward. If we count contract revenues as local match, it doesn't get deducted from total operating expenses. So our net cost of service has gone up dramatically to $768,000. That has resulted in an increase in both the federal and local share needed to match that higher level of net cost of service. We've jumped from 301 up to 384. But if we relied on local government appropriations only as our source of local match, we've actually reduced the amount of local government appropriation down to 219. We've saved the city or the county about 81K because we can count the 165 as part of this 301,500, half of the portion of the 384. Excuse me. Question.
But that 165 has to be earned in a previous fiscal year.
No, not with contract revenue. Contract revenues can be used as match in the year in which they were earned, which is contrary to what FTA tells you about any other income source, program income in particular. So they want you to be clear about that. So it depends. If you're an organization, maybe you're a 5307 recipient, you only get so much federal money. If you only get $310,000 in your 5307 apportionment, quite frankly, this may be the better deal for you. Because you're going to have to make up the lack of FTA money over there, if that's all that your mark is when FTA does the apportionment table. But if you're like most rural entities, this is almost always the preferred methodology if you want to save the city council or the county commissioner's cash. This also creates a powerful incentive for you to go out there and preparing those coordinated public transit human service agency plans and try to get other human service agencies that need client transportation to buy it from you rather than delivering it themselves, because this is a powerful coordination incentive. This promotes another public policy that's kind of like mom, apple pie, and the flag. Coordination is good. And here's an economic justification of that. And I know we can debate the relative merits of using Medicaid brokerages and that tends to be anti-coordination. And that can or cannot be the case depending on what state you live in. Brokerage works great for coordination in Tennessee. A little less so here in Georgia, from what little I've seen. But this is a powerful matching tool. You're essentially doing what a lot of politicians want you to do. How can we best leverage the federal dollars we have coming into our community? This is a method that your little transit system, and you may just be a tiny fraction of city or county government from a budgetary standpoint. But this is a pretty substantial leveraging that will get even the most conservative of politicians to sit up and take notice. So it is, in my mind, a powerful tool. And it promotes coordination. As someone who's cut his transit teeth on day one as a staff member, working for DOT on the Governor's Advisory Blue Ribbon Commission on Transportation Coordination, having drafted the executive order in North Carolina, it means a little to me. So I'm very pro-transit coordination. Got a question
I know
here.
we went over a lot of the FTA guidelines, and you've given us the circulars where we can refer back to. Does GDOT have something similar to that, since there are some differences in what they were required to allow? FTA?
Most state dots, when it comes down to it, do not deviate from the circulars very much. From what I can see so far, very little. GDOT doesn't restrict FTA in too many ways. Because you have so many 5311 recipients in the state, the initial determination made in the late 70s is that every county was entitled to a little slice of the pie, and you have, God knows what, 160 some counties here? Yeah. Wayne Jackson, bless his heart, made the decision that that's how you were going to do distribution back then. FTA was going crazy with that decision. They wanted a more rational distribution method that would allow for dollars, a little more meaningful dollar grants to be awarded. But Wayne didn't see it that way, and you're kind of paying the price a little bit now, and now you're focusing on regionalization. That's the one mistake I made. I'll readily concede to that. When we created our coordination program in North Carolina, at the time, the county commissioners were the most politically powerful body in the state, and they wanted coordination at the county level. So by golly, that's what our plan said. If we had to do it over again today, we would consolidate at the regional level, not the county level. And you guys are moving towards that. That's sound public policy. So other than that, Georgia DOT pretty much plays by the FTA rule book. You're not going to find a lot of exceptions.
So when there are exceptions, because we talked about a few today, it seems like there were some differences. Where can we refer to? Because I don't want to work in the gray. I kind of want certain.
I'd go to the GDOT website, and all of those exceptions should be articulated in the DOT State Management Plan for the 5311 program.
On that last slide where you were showing the contract revenues, one scenario that you didn't cover that sometimes occurs in Georgia is that they have contract revenues above and beyond the local match requirement, what we call excess revenues. And then it has been our guidance that you can't just ignore those revenues. You should then therefore take them out from the revenue side, which would reduce your net operating deficit.
Yeah, all right, this is,
I had to open that can of worms because it happened. We can talk
you got
about
40
it tomorrow.
people sitting in here looking at their wristwatch knowing that it's 3 minutes to 5, and you know what they're saying about you right now. Needless to say, I'll tell you what she's referring to is that, as impossible as it may seem, it actually can happen, it does happen, that no matter how you slice this pie, this amount of money could exceed 301 or could exceed 384. In which case, what do you do with it? Most of you guys want to put it in the bank and forget about it. What should be happening, for lack of a better term, this is what Ohio DOT always called it. It's called push-up. And anytime contract revenues exceed the local matching requirement, the excess gets pushed up and used to reduce the net cost of service. The deductive method is applied to surplus contract revenues.
So then we could have a rainy
Now,
day fund.
this kind of assumes sort of the scenario where your contract rate pricing is recovering fully allocated costs. That may or may not be the case. I don't know. Never tested that here in Georgia. It happens more frequently than you think would be possible. And so there has to be a formula method to treat that excess revenue. I know you guys have gotten creative, and everybody wants to keep that money and put it aside and not have it impact the 5311 reimbursement calculation. But technically, that's not how it's supposed to work. I don't think FTA or Congress ever envisioned that your contract revenues would ever exceed local matching share requirements. And in the early days of 5311, when this ability to use monies as match was capped at 1/2 of the local share, you would take 384, divide that by 2, get 192, and that was the maximum contract revenue you could apply. And the rest had to get remanipulated up here to reduce total project costs. So that revenue's got to remain in the operating equation. And how you do that is primarily left to the states. In ODOT State Management Plan in Ohio, they call it push-up and give you some examples. And I think that's basically what Michelle is trying to say here. You just don't get to take money off the table, take it out of the project. You just can't do that. Now, FTA generally is pretty liberal here. They want the money to remain on the table and in the project. In other words, we want you to continue to use that excess revenues to promote and operate public transit service in the service area. What we don't want is to take that excess transit revenue, move it over to the nutrition program, and pay for congregate meals or home delivered meals. That's what we don't want, because we use transit money to generate that income. FTA generally takes the most liberal of stances, all things considered, and will let you keep that money as long as you keep it in transit. You just can't reinvest it in weatherization improvements or home health care or, other types of programs that your nonprofit might operate.
I think some of the issue we run into is when we do have an excess and GDOT hasn't paid, using that excess to fund transit because you don't know when that reimbursement.
Are you suggesting that GDOT doesn't pay its invoices on a timely manner? Every state pays within 30 days. Are you kidding me? GDOT is paying for me to be here. I'm not going to agree with you there.
Which transit agency are you with?
Oh, we'll talk later.
There's a politician wannabe right there. I can tell. She's got designs on elected office. But in any event, we are now right on time, a minute late. I promised I wouldn't keep you a minute late, but we'll all blame Michelle for doing that question. We will start tomorrow with some more FTA grants management issues that are non-OMB related. Everyone have a good evening. Enjoy the reception. First timers, I think they got something special planned for you tonight. Please enjoy.
8:30 morning, 8 a.m. Are we 8 in the morning or 8:30?
I